our community. We are a broad coalition. We've got students and retirees, renters, homeowners, new residents, old, but we all share a vision for a vibrant and a welcoming and a sustainable Palo Alto. And if you're excited by that vision, I encourage you to sign up on our newsletter at paloaltoforward.com. As Angie mentioned, a few technical notes. All participants are currently muted and off video. We're going to start with a great presentation from John Wizard, and then we'll reserve a lot of time for Q&A. As you think of questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box on Zoom at the bottom. And as always, we encourage everybody to bring positive intentions. No matter your perspective, let's be ready to listen, learn, and give folks the benefit of the doubt. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by John Wizard, a city council member in the city of Seaside and policy director for YIMBY Law. We're very lucky. John brings a tremendous amount of expertise to housing policy, as well as just a deep passion for this work. So, John, before we get started with your presentation, could you just share a little bit about kind of what brought you into housing advocacy and just why this work matters to you?
Yeah, thank you. And that was an awfully nice introduction. The short story is I grew up in San Diego in a neighborhood called Ocean Beach. I didn't know anything about anything. I think I was maybe 10 or 11 years old when this happened, but I remember sitting in my bedroom and hearing my parents outside the window discussing with our landlord how his proposal to double the rent would make us homeless. And, what does a 10-year-old know about that? How can they conceptualize what that really means and the hardships that would follow? But now as an adult and reflecting back on that, I think, it was a miracle that situation didn't happen and that we were able to stay housed in that home. And, that kind of lit the fire at first, and then I was lucky enough to be appointed to my county's planning commission, where we talked about all things housing and planning related. And then the thing that really locked it in for me, where I thought I have to, this is just an issue area that I can't not be a part of, was the city next to us here on the Monterey Peninsula. They, in their general plan, they had a commitment, 20% affordable housing on all new development, and they just botched it. Just totally missed that. They had a development proposal for several hundred hotel rooms, a couple hundred new apartments and condos, and there was zero affordability in the project. I mean, not one unit of affordability. And several of us got together and advocated for that change. And the city manager, who was also the planning director, it's a small place, essentially said, sorry, the ship sailed, we're not going to go back and do that. And then when some area partners encouraged them to do what's in their own general plan, suddenly that person was no longer affiliated with the city, and the project hit the brakes so that they could add that back in. And so seeing that advocacy worked was okay, where do I do this some more? Because this stuff is critical. And if we just, roll over and let this happen everywhere, that's terrible. So where else can I engage? And that was the beginning of the story.
That's great. And I think it speaks to a lot of the experiences and values that make housing such a compelling issue for all of us. And I think is a really helpful thing to keep in mind as we turn into the housing element. And what is the housing element, and how can we get involved to make sure it is promoting a affordable and sustainable community? So without further ado, John, do you want to start the presentation?
Yeah, let me call it up and get my screen shared. All right, is everybody able to see that? Oh, wait, hold on, maybe not. There we go. Is everybody able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I did it in reverse order and I probably shouldn't have, but anyway. So we're talking about how to advocate for a more affordable and equitable housing element and how to engage. So we'll talk about affordable housing in housing elements, the housing element process specifically, and opportunities to advocate throughout that entire process. So specifically about affordability. Oh, sorry, it was a little slow and I skipped ahead. There we go. So this is by way of Santa Monica, just because the LA region is further along. And so there's more, it's a more fruitful discussion to show you examples as opposed to talk in the abstract about what might happen in the Bay Area. So you can see here, Santa Monica has a requirement to build just shy of, or I'm sorry, to plan for just shy of 9,000 homes. In technical talk, very low is actually the combination of extremely low and very low. So if the city has not broken out an extremely low column, or row rather, then extremely low and very low are together, and it's just split down the middle 50-50. So in this case, Santa Monica's got to do roughly 1,400 extremely low and roughly 1,400 very low. And also those 1,672 low, those three categories together, extremely low, very low, and low, together equal lower income. We band those three together to make lower income, even though low income sounds like lower and everybody gets confused. So if you see a reference to lower income, just be aware that's actually three categories of affordability, whereas low, the smaller word, is one category. So moderate income, while it does start at 81%, which is below 100, it's considered to be market rate. And so it's not considered to be lower income. And of course, above moderate is well above 100% of the median income and is actually what the market commands, even though nobody thinks of it as being more than what the market would support, because moderate is that sort of like, well, you're on a moderate income, you can kind of afford what's around, not a chance. Above moderate is whatever pennies someone can extract from you for the purposes of housing. So that's a lot of information about how to kind of read it, but it's important to orient to it so that we can have a little bit greater understanding. So this on the right-hand side is the synopsis of Santa Monica's annual progress report. So every year in April, cities have to transmit to the state their information. This is how many permits we issued in the last year. And over the 7-year period that ended in 2020, this is the number that Santa Monica did. So you can see very low income, not too bad, 85%. They almost made it. Lower income, low income, not as good. Moderate income, just terrible. I mean, not anywhere near what we want to see. But above moderate, wow, no problems at all. Nearly 300% of what they were supposed to do. And so that begs the question, where do the dwelling units, the homes, go if all of the parcels and spots are taken by a 300% development rate for the most expensive housing in our communities? If we take those parcels off the map, there isn't anywhere left for them to go. So it's really important that we focus on those lower and moderate income housing opportunities. This is the same data presented differently, but as you can see with the various years, it peaks and troughs. But even in the lean years, it was significantly more above moderate than any other housing type. And in the better years, again, significantly more. Housing element compliance is part of this larger affordability conversation. And so some of the penalties that can be attached when a city fails to plan accordingly or otherwise permit the affordable housing, it's been, it told the state that it would. You can be fined up to $600,000 a month, depending on how badly you're out of compliance. You disqualified for state and regional funding through ABAG and NHCD. A judge can order that you come into compliance through whatever means they think are appropriate. A judge can suspend your local land use powers. A judge can appoint like a special master, like somebody who would review protected information. They can appoint a special master who designs a housing element for you. And the city professional staff and the public have no input whatsoever. It's only to bring the city into compliance. And there's no control from the local government whatsoever. And the last is a moratorium on all new permits, including kitchen and bath remodels, business permits, any kind of renovations to existing structures. Just if you can't approve affordable housing, then you can't approve anything at all. And once you get that figured out, we'll talk about you coming back to get that power back. So really, from small to big, the penalties are meant to encourage people to not get into the penalty phase, is the best way that I could describe that.
And John, if I can just jump in here, I think there are some questions that you might have if you're new to this space. It seems like there are some really serious fines and consequences for not being compliant with the housing element. But I think one might ask, why do we do a housing element? Who's making us do a housing element? And does a housing element actually mean that you need to actually build the housing? Or does it just mean that you need to plan for it?
So the housing element is just one of those things that came about after the baby boom, and legislators, surprisingly, I guess, realized that there was a severe underproduction of housing in the state of California that was driving up the cost at a rate faster than inflation. And so they came up with this grand idea that we'll have this housing element. It'll be part of the general plan, and you have to describe what it is you're doing to satisfy this need for housing in your community. And California has, as part of the Wild West, has long had this tradition of local control. And so housing and zoning and planning has been one of those things that has been historically devolved from state government. You handle business in your city, we'll make statewide policy. And while that sounds good on the surface, it did not account for malicious compliance. It did not account for ineptitude and incompetence, and it didn't account for the speed at which things change between neighboring cities. And so over the first 25 to 30 years of housing element law, it was largely an academic exercise. There was not a lot of merit to these things. And then slowly more rules and regulations began to attach. And now, especially after 2017, it has become sort of the central long-range planning document that cities must produce to demonstrate how they are not taking housing for granted, and that they are at least making a concerted effort to say, the state of California told us, based on financial information, demographic information, jobs information, that there will be, in Santa Monica's case, 9,000 people who need somewhere to live in the next 8 years.
Yeah.
Where are we going to put them? And how are we going to put them? Are we going to annex new property outside the city limits and build a bunch of single family homes? Are we going to do apartment towers? Are we going to do condos? Are we going to do duplexes everywhere? How are we going to accommodate all these people? And of course, there are family units that are not, so you don't need 9,000 new homes, but you need to plan for 9,000 new people. And so what does that look like?
Right.
And
so just to make things specific in Palo Alto, we have a goal right now for the next cycle of the housing element, also known as the sixth cycle. This is now happening 6 times. We have a target of about 6,000 homes. So
right.
Concretely in Palo Alto, what does it mean to plan for 6,000 homes? And what are some tools at our disposal as we think about planning for that number of homes?
Yeah, so 6,000 new homes in Palo Alto is totally feasible. But you don't even need 6,000 new homes, because you'll have some family units that will be 2 people, will be 8 people, and everywhere in between, and maybe even more. So the idea that Palo Alto couldn't reasonably plan for 2,500 new homes is unimaginative and not a serious commitment to the task at hand. Because between the sites, the actual Fry's site and around Fry's, you could do a ton of homes. And also, if the city wants to preserve some of that, there is a lot of land dedicated to office space. And the idea that we could only have 1-story offices, maybe even 2-story offices, but not have residential for a floor or 2 above that. If I was building microchips, I don't know that I would want to have a family right above me, but then don't do that. I mean, co-locate things that would be complementary toward housing, like a printing service or bakeries and pharmacies and services that people need. I don't go down the street to buy a microchip, but I do go down the street to buy bread. I do go down the street to pick up my medication. So The Palo Alto is sufficiently large to accommodate 6,000 new people. And certainly they do it every day, more than 6,000, but those people arrive in cars and then leave every evening. And so we can also have a much longer conversation about the follow-on impacts of climate injury with all of the people commuting into and out of the city every day who would probably prefer to spend that time with their loved ones or on a hobby or asleep or whatever it might be, and not spend all that time on the road. So in terms of being a good neighbor and a good regional partner, Palo Alto should be figuring out how to do this with serious intent and a commitment to actually achieving it, not how do we create a plan that's good enough to stay out of trouble, but doesn't actually accomplish anything, and we don't have to even build one new home.
That's really helpful. And again, I think there's a lot of technical terminology and laws and regulations that go into this. So as folks are listening to this, feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll make sure we get to them. No question is too basic.
Right.
We know there's a lot to digest there. Thanks, John.
Yeah, and this part is probably the most technical it will be, and it's just sort of orienting to like the larger conversation. And you can see there's this web address yimby.cc/consequences. That is a more in-depth version of this table you see below that gets into more specifics and a little bit more narrative around these things. So it's a resource that's available. And just, this looks like a lot of words, but really it's just illustrative. And basically, you hear a lot about all these bad housing elements. You hear that, Cupertino and Palo Alto and Corte Madera and all of these wealthier Bay Area cities have appealed their RHNA number. And we don't often hear about positives in this space. Where are the good housing elements? Where do I look for a good reference point? And the city of Los Angeles is by and large the best example to date. San Diego did okay, but they really dropped the ball on their affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis and their site inventory, where they told the state, we could put a housing here, we could put housing there, check out this area, we could put it over here. They had zoned cemeteries and brand new buildings that were still under construction, said that they were going to add housing. It was really not well done. And the state has yet to make a determination about San Diego's element for those reasons. Los Angeles, on the other hand, has seen a nearly 6-fold increase between the last planning cycle and the current planning cycle. And they've got to accommodate 456,000 homes, 456,000 homes. Now, granted, they're the largest city in the state. There's nearly 3.5 million people there. So this number is commensurate with other areas in the state. That being said, they're recognizing that in order to actually accomplish this number, they've got to plan for way more. Because I don't know if everybody caught that detail, but Robert said this is the 6th cycle. This is the 6th time we've gone through this process. Have we met the need in every previous cycle? Of course, the answer is no. There's rampant homelessness. There are people living in unsanitary and unsafe conditions, and there is an obvious need for new housing, more housing in our communities. So if we had met that burden every time, either the state failed in the number that they were issuing, or we haven't actually been building that number. And the latter is the true statement, which is why the numbers have increased so exponentially over these successive cycles. We're trying to recognize that there has been a historic underproduction, and how do we get to homeostasis today? The city of LA is the first and only city in the state of California to actually create a draft, sort of a framework in which that can be accomplished. Sacramento City got close. I give them a low B. It was a good attempt, but it just didn't quite go far enough. But LA, they're not playing around. And their direction to the city council from the planning department is, we're doing everything we can, and now it's a political problem whether you want to listen to us or not. Nearby in Culver City, that city council drafted a resolution that essentially directed their consultant, their housing element preparer, to follow a laundry list of goals and ideas, including everything under the sun that you would want to have a model housing element, but we have yet to actually see the physical document, and it is not yet finalized. So, LA has got the framework from the city staff, and they've given it to the city council to mull over and work on. Culver City has told their consultant, this is what we want. We'll wait for you to deliver. And hopefully that actually happens.
So John, one thing that would be really helpful to talk about is, as you think about a good city like Los Angeles that has been taking the housing element really seriously, how can a city that's trying to take its housing element seriously and make sure that we actually build housing at all income levels, what are ways that they can identify sites that are likely to make for good housing? And what are policies that they can promote to actually encourage the development of that housing, such that you can close the gap between kind of what you plan for, you plan for a certain income level, you plan for a certain number of units, and then what actually gets built during the cycle, because you've identified this gap that we've experienced in previous housing elements between what we plan for and between what we actually get.
I have two technical terms, and I will define them. One is realistic capacity, which is to say, yeah, I see that there's this empty parcel. It's next to the library. It's got chain link fence around it. It's been vacant forever. What is the realistic number of homes that could fit on this parcel? And that is essentially whatever the city has zoned that parcel for. So we'll just say it's 30 dwelling units per acre of land. And if that site is a half an acre, within 15 is the legal number they could put there, according to the city's arbitrary and self-invented zoning code. However, you couldn't really put 15 there because you have to account for parking, height restrictions, curbs, gutters, sidewalks, setbacks, and all the other amenities that the city might require, like X amount of square feet of private open space and Y amount of square feet of public open space. And so really the number is closer to 10. Okay, that's the realistic capacity. What's the true number of homes that could fit on this patch of dirt? The other, and sometimes confusing and confused with technical term, is the likelihood of development. And the way you can think about that is probability. What is the probability that this site will get developed? Now, granted, you could put 10 homes here, but what is the likelihood, the probability that that 10 homes would ever get built? And so those two are cousins, but they're different things, because if the likelihood is 0, it doesn't matter what the realistic capacity is. But if the likelihood is 100%, then it matters very much what that realistic capacity is, because if the city claims it's 30, but really it's 10, well, suddenly there's a delta of 20 homes that will never get built. And wow, how come we can't meet our numbers? So one way that you can do that is a program called ground truthing. And that's what Chris here, professor of law at UC Davis, on the right-hand screenshot of his tweet, that's what he's talking about. May require LA to zone for 10 times as much capacity, because while you can say we have zoned for 10,000 new homes, if the likelihood is such that only 1 in 5 gets built, well, then I guess you have to zone for 5 times as much to actually hit your number. And if the capacity of those sites is 50%, well, then you need to double the amount you've planned for so that your realistic capacity doesn't create a choke point and you don't actually build the housing that you're supposed to. So when we say Palo Alto's got a number of 6,000, if Palo Alto truly wanted to build 6,000 new homes, it would have to plan for somewhere near 100,000, because there's no way that you can say 6,000 and 6,000 gets built. That's not how macroeconomics works. That's not how supply and demand works. That's not how housing development works. So what you can do is this ground truthing. People who are intimately familiar with their cities. I don't know much about Palo Alto. I know there's the Fry's Electronics site and the area there around. I know there's transit sites, or rather sites near transit. I know there's a lot of office space, but I couldn't begin to tell you where a good place to put housing is in the city because I'm not from there. I don't know anything about it. That being said, you do. You're the experts. And so when you see the city's site inventory, which is a required component of the housing element, usually it's an appendix. So it's easy to reference, but sometimes they just kind of fold it in. Santa Monica, for instance, has a 1,700-page housing element. So good luck finding it anywhere in there. Hopefully Palo Alto doesn't do that, but you can go to the site inventory and you can look at the addresses. there's a law that describes, actually Evan Lowe out of Campbell wrote the law. It describes the mandatory components that make up a site inventory spreadsheet. APN, the assessor's parcel number, address, does it have water and electrical and sewer? Was it already listed in a previous housing element? How big is it? What's the density? What's the zoning? All of these things have to be reported on the site inventory. So you could pull up an address that you're familiar with on Google Maps and go, wait a second. Or you could drive by it or walk by it or bike by it and say, there's no way. This site isn't 2 acres big. This site isn't, there is no water service to this site. There's no electrical. This is not an appropriate site. There's no way for volunteers throughout California to have that level of knowledge about the parcels in your city. And so that's where you would come in as a volunteer in this housing element process, specifically about ground truthing.
Awesome. And it looks like we've got a couple questions coming in here. Let's start with Angie.
Hi, everybody. I was actually just going to kind of to layer on to what John said, who is an absolute expert. I am not an expert, and that is part of why sometimes I like to try and explain some of the things and translate some of it. And I think one of the things that's really important to know in Palo Alto, every city, and I think John will talk about some of this, every city is in a different point in their process. And the city of Palo Alto appointed a housing element working group with 15 or 16 community members to help identify those sites and policies. John, thumbs up, thumbs down. You're going to talk a little bit about this, right?
Yes.
Okay. That's it. I'm done.
Oh, okay.
So why don't we, John, we'll turn it back over to you. And then folks, as they have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And then hopefully we'll get a run through. I know we've got some questions on kind of how are housing allocations even given to cities? You know, how did Palo Alto end up with 6,000 as a target? And we'll make sure to get to that right after John's slides.
Yeah, and these ones will go pretty quick. That was the bulkiest and most technical part. And these are more of like flow charts. And it's actually, it could be one slide, but for purposes of, you know, avoiding visual monotony, it's broken up a little bit, but they'll be relatively quick if they ever want to load. And if they don't, we can just abandon them. I can answer some questions that might be more productive. So I'll give this a second more. Has it, Robert, has it shown up on your screen, or is it still
a little, yeah. So you got some white rectangles decorating the slide.
Well, let's,
there you go.
All right, so regional housing needs allocation. The state of California talks to the Department of Finance and the Office of Planning and Research, all state organizations, and they come up with the regional housing needs determination. ABAG, the 9 Bay Area region of the greater San Francisco metropolitan area, here is your number. ABAG takes that number and they form a working group or just do it in their open session of their meetings, and they come up with a methodology. That methodology describes how they're going to allocate each city and county's share of that bigger aggregate RH and D number. Part of the methodology is how they break it down into those income groups. Oh boy. I pushed the button, but nothing happened, Robert. Oh, there we go. So they're required to do public outreach to all economic sectors of the community. That's the government code. So they're supposed to be talking to the homeowners there's a Bayview area. Am I making that up in Palo Alto? No, there is a Bayview mobile home park. Buena Vista?
There's Buena Vista.
Yeah, Buena Vista.
Yeah,
so we have a Bayview and Seaside, and I always forget which one is which. There's Buena Vista Mobile Home Park, and then the neighborhood association right next to it, where Lydia Koo lives and tried to block the housing for developmentally disabled adults that was going to go in across the street. Anyway, that whole part of the city, they'll talk to homeowners over there. Then they'll go to a homeless shelter and talk to people there. Then they'll go to senior housing and talk to those people. Then they'll go to some apartment dwellers. Maybe Robert gets a petition or a questionnaire. And everybody is supposed to be contributing to both the methodology at ABAG and the RENA process within the city. Planning departments, they draft the documents or they hire a consultant to help them do it. And that again is supposed to have surveys and focus groups and interviews, and to be more qualitative and quantitative to build a good base document. And then the Planning Commission will have a hearing, either adopt it or not, make revisions. Once they adopt it, it goes to the City Council, and the City Council will adopt the draft, transmit that to the state and say, what do you all think about this? The state will give them some comments and send it back. And then the city will make those revisions. It goes back to the Planning Commission for final approval, back to the City Council for final approval, back to the state to say, look, we did the things you asked for. Will you please certify it as we're done? That includes a 30-day process for anybody who was late. You just moved to the city, you just came out of a coma, you were developing a new app and you couldn't even look up from your desk. Holy smokes, I missed the public hearing at City Council. I got to get my comments on the record. You talk to HCD for that first 30 days after they receive it from the city.
And John, sorry, what is HCD?
I'm sorry, HCD is the Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the state housing department. They do this sort of long-range planning stuff on one side, and the other side is a lot of grants, like for ADUs and for affordable housing and for building apartments and rehabbing farm worker housing. They're a very busy place. So that's sort of the housing element in a nutshell, what it is and how you do it. And then how do you fit in? Because I kind of glossed over really quick what happens with a housing element, but where do you fit into the process is an important part of that conversation. So you're doing a good thing first now is getting educated, connecting with local groups. And there's a law that says if you contact your city and say, hey, I want to be copied on emails about public outreach and the various events that are happening around the housing element, they must put you on a mailing list as an interested party, and you get every communication just like you're part of the city staff or you're the consultant team. You cannot be excluded from the process. And while we're a little late in this conversation, you can just fire off an unsolicited email to your planning department, say, I want to be part of this task force. I want to be part of the working group. And there is a good possibility they pick a couple, at-large members of the public to do that, if that's not the whole committee. I don't know why it always has such a problem with step 2. It just doesn't like it. But we will persevere. So other ways that you can get involved are through finding or creating rather your own like subgroups. So like Palo Alto Forward is a great sort of meeting place to have these bigger conversations. But for instance, let's say that you are particularly interested in the YIMBY movement. Yes, in God's backyard. You want to see more apartments and some housing come on to the various religious sites throughout the city because you have an affinity to a particular religious group. You can form like a special cohort, a subgroup, and either work with Palo Alto Forward or not. I would encourage you to, because there's a lot of brain power and energy around it already, and sort of like take on that special niche part of the housing element, which is a legitimate part that, Laguna Woods down in the OC area thinks they're going to build like 80% of their housing on religious sites, but none of the pastors down there know that. So that would be an important thing for people to advocate about. Other things that you can advocate for or advocate around include AFFH, or affirmatively furthering fair housing. A lot of cities will say, oh, well, ADUs, they're the promised land of new housing in our community. They're great, but ADUs don't offer homeownership opportunities. ADUs are typically too small for family-sized households.
Sorry, John, what's an ADU?
An accessory dwelling unit, a granny flat, a casita, a backyard home. And if you decide that you think that missing middle housing and homeownership opportunities are a central piece to equity within Palo Alto, the more ADUs, the more accessory dwelling units, the more casitas, the more granny flats the city relies on, the less opportunity there is for those homeownership and missing middle opportunities. So that might be a thing that you want to take up as your charge. I want to make sure the city doesn't abuse this thing. I'm just gonna cancel my screen sharing because it doesn't seem to be working anymore. And I don't want to, oh, now it's working. Okay, so engage in public meetings, go to the planning commission meetings, go to the task force meetings, go to the city council meetings, write letters, to contact HCD, be loud because squeaky wheels get the grease. You can participate with Palo Alto Forward, and Angie told me earlier that she's been encouraging, Palo Alto Forward's been encouraging, letting us know at the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements so that we can support you as well. So we have, Jess and I, my coworker, we have a lot of tools and resources, but if we don't know that it's happening, we can't really get engaged. So the more you tell us about it, the more we can do. Review the drafts, form like a ballot party, when there's an election, a couple of people get together on Zoom or at a coffee shop or at a park or whatever it might be, and pick a different section and go through the housing element and see just what doesn't make sense. We have a tool that is a very lengthy document, so I suggest finding friends, and you can pick out different pieces and say, wait a second, they're saying they're going to build 1,000 ADUs, 1,000 of these accessory dwelling units, but in the last 3 years, they only permitted 5 a year. Well, 5 times 8 years in a planning period is not 1,000. That seems like it's wrong. So those little things are helpful to catch before the city says, yeah, looks good to us. Let's send that off to the state for their approval. And last is just to keep that momentum going, is encourage people to attend meetings, engage in some self-care and some mental health and rest. But, as much as you can do this, the better, because we have historically, as a people in the state of California, not been as engaged as we could have been. And that has let particularly people in the Bay Area, more Cupertino than Palo Alto, but nevertheless, get away with some pretty bad stuff that has really harmed our communities. So partner with us at YIMBY Law in the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements, partner with YIMBY Action. They're doing some great stuff. Continue to partner with Palo Alto Forward. And I will skip this section because I want to make sure we have time for questions. How's that sound, Robert?
That's perfect. And thank you again, John. John has just been doing an extraordinary effort coordinating a lot of the housing element activism around the entire Bay Area in California. And it's really amazing to see it come together. John, we've got a bunch of questions here. I think the place to start is really talking again at a high level about, okay, what is really going on with this housing element, and demystifying some of the basic elements here. So we talked about how Palo Alto has a goal of about 6,000 housing units. Those could be single family homes, they could be duplexes, they could be apartment buildings, they could be ADUs. 6,000, I think it's actually 6,083. It's a really specific number. And it's actually a fair step up from the last cycle. And I think one of the questions that we're getting is just, how are those numbers determined? And kind of, why would you put housing in Palo Alto? And kind of, what is the process for actually making that allocation determination?
So the numbers are based on, I think it's 5 statutory factors and then 10 or 11 rulemaking based factors. So the legislators write a law, and then the state organization, the state department that has to enforce and support that law goes through a rulemaking process where they describe how they're going to affect the implementation of that law that was passed. So there's 5 things that are spelled out in the code in the legislature, and then there's 10 or 11 things that have come to fruition through that rulemaking. AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing, which was a local law that was written after we saw Ben Carson and Donald Trump try to wind that back at the federal level. That got baked into state housing law. Transportation, jobs, housing balance, population growth. There's one more that I'm forgetting, but those 5 factors together create that basis for how many homes will this region need. The way the regions are defined, they're called councils of governments. And so ABAG is a council of governments, SACOG, Sacramento County or Sacramento Council of Governments, FCOG for Fresno, AMBAG for Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, which is not at all confusing with ABAG. There are COGS big and small. And so once the COG gets that number, they go through that methodology process, and they have to factor in those 10 or 11 planning-based rulemaking factors. So they determine, well, how much do we care about public transit? Is it more rail or more bus or ferries? Like, how do we, to what degree do we weigh that into this equation? What is the jobs housing balance presently in each individual city? So San Jose has a different jobs housing balance than Palo Alto, than does Atherton, than does anywhere else. That, Santa Rosa, Piedmont, Antioch. So they factor that in. There's 10 of these factors, and they assign value to each of them by a majority vote. And then they plug in this aggregated number from the state into this formula, and it spits out, Palo Alto's got X, and Petaluma's got Y, and so on. For your case specifically, ABAG is different than MTC, the Metropolitan Transit. I forget what the C is. Metropolitan Transportation something. Anyway. The people that work on transit around the Bay Area is MTC.
Right.
MTC came up with Plan Bay Area 2050. Commission, thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
I just went right out of my brain. They came up with Plan Bay Area 2050. And so that was the transit piece and how people move throughout the region. They married those things together, and that's how Palo Alto ended up with, I think it was actually closer to, was it 9,000? And then that number got reduced down to closer to 6,000 because they decided to rebalance it based on transit and the jobs housing balance throughout that greater 9-county region.
Terrific. We've got a couple more questions that we're going to hopefully try to get to. We're down to our last 10 minutes or so. We've got a great question here about the types of housing strategies and the types of housing that work best in meeting our housing goals. So Brian writes, do we have a sense of what is the easiest housing to get approved and actually built? For example, do we know in the cities that have come closest to meeting their building targets, to what extent has this been achieved by market rate versus affordable housing, or multi versus single family?
Yeah, so affordable housing requires tremendous subsidy. So housing that is affordable has to do with individual households' income. Affordable housing, this subsidized housing, can be something relatively small, like here's a first-time home buyer loan at 1% simple interest, and it'll be a balloon payment at the end, but if you refi, you can pay it off early and all this other stuff, which sounds more palatable to people who are a little bit more concerned about having earned a government benefit, all the way to housing choice vouchers from the housing authority, and tax credit based and grant based housing for people who will never have income, like the developmentally disabled adults that I mentioned earlier near the Buena Vista area of Palo Alto. It's hard for people with a developmental disability to have incomes high enough to support buying a home in Palo Alto. It's hard for a lot of people of any walk of life to be able to afford to buy a house in Palo Alto. But if I have a disability that's recognized by the state of California, I need help in order to live. And that doesn't mean that I have to live out in 29 Palms or Bishop or Tracy or Turlock or Stockton. I should be able to live near my family or near my supports. And if that's Palo Alto, okay, that's Palo Alto. So that gets several $1 million of tax credit financing where the developer gets to claim a depreciated rate and enjoy a tax benefit for building that kind of housing. They get they get money from the state of California. They get money from nonprofits like Stanford to build this type of housing, because those people are dignified human beings who deserve housing in the community as well. And so that housing is very expensive to build, which is why it looks the way it does. Because to answer the second part of that question, one home on 1 acre eats the entire cost of that land. 10 homes on 1 acre split the cost of the land 10 times. 100 homes on an acre split the cost of the land 100 times. So the more homes you have on a particular parcel, the less they're each paying, contributing to the cost of the land underneath the structure, which drives down the costs substantially because one household doesn't have to pay $2 million for a patch of dirt, but 100 households can each pay $10,000. That's significantly different.
Great. That's super helpful. Thank you. And we have then a question from Scott O'Neill. Scott writes, the fines and consequences, once your element is actually approved by HCD, are you good from a compliance perspective? Or are there ways that a city can actually get penalized for not actually producing the actual units in spite of an approved element? And I think Scott's question gets to this gap that we often see between what we plan for in a housing element and then what actually gets built and the homes that folks actually have to live in. So John, how would you address that?
Yeah, well, first I'll just thank Angie. My knowledge of Palo Alto is slim and fading. And so Wilton Court is exactly the place I've been talking about, not the Buena Vista Mobile Home Park. And so thank you for putting that into the chat and helping people, helping me get my words out, even though I've been saying it wrong the whole time. To answer your question, Robert, cities are not off the hook when they get certified. Part of the way that we keep cities accountable is that we advocate to build in a requirement to ensure ongoing compliance. So a thing that I mentioned briefly earlier was that cities have been over-relying on their accessory dwelling unit production. Santa Monica, for instance, says that they're going to build 750, but they've only permitted, I think it's close to 30 in the past 3 years. Well, that's 10 a year. 10 a year times 8 is 80, not 750. That's nearly a 10 times increase. But if we advocate and say, okay, fine, you can count 750, or in Palo Alto's case, 400, 500, whatever the number might be. But every year you have to review your permits. And if you fall short, you have to rezone other areas to make up for that shortfall. That's a way that you can prevent this ongoing and cyclical shortfall that we've faced year after year, decade after decade. Another way you can do that is you can have something called a mid-cycle review. And that's basically the city looks at the housing elements programs and policies and production goals. And hopefully you can start a little early, because if you start at the midpoint, you won't actually finish till year 5, and then you're close to being done and having to start over. But if you can get that done around year 4, that can totally change the conversation, because if the city says, well, shoot, we're only 10% of the way where we thought we'd be, well, they wouldn't have known that if they didn't look. So it's important to get that that review built into the process so that there's a way to hold them accountable. If the city is hesitant to do those things, it can still catch HCD's, the State Department of Housing's attention by way of advocates just like you, who can say, hey, wait a second, the city said that they were going to build, permit something like X amount of thousand homes, 6,086. They had to rezone these parcels. We're sufficiently big in the Bay Area now that the Mullen density, from former Assembly member Gene Mullen of South San Francisco, the Mullen density is 30 dwelling units per acre for every lower income site, all of them. That's the minimum. So not above moderate, not moderate, but any lower income site, minimum density is 30 dwelling units per acre. And this site, they only built 10, and it's 2 acres big because they required all this open space and park and conservation and community benefits. That doesn't seem right. And they do that a couple of times. You tell the state about it, well, they're going to fall short. They're never going to meet that 6,086. And so the state will send them a letter and say, hey, guys, by the way, we noticed there's a problem. You need to immediately rezone. You have 1 year to do it. And if you don't, we'll take you to court.
Really helpful. And obviously there is this kind of constant back and forth between cities and the state on what does it mean to actually be in compliance and things like that. And one of the things that we've actually seen in Palo Alto is a sense that the city would actually like to appeal its allocation from its regional housing needs, right? Those are the 6,086 homes that Palo Alto has been assigned through the housing element process. And so we've got a question from Karen here. What are the implications of the Palo Alto City Council appeal of that regional housing needs allocation goal of 6,086 homes?
Well, first I'd say that the city council appears to be looking a gift horse in the mouth. They already got a 33% reduction. So now to appeal again and say, well, I know it was 9,000, but 6,000 is still too much. Okay, well, what they're really saying is, hey, everybody else, all 100 other cities and counties in the San Francisco Bay region, we don't feel like we have to do what we all agreed to do. So a phenomenon that you learn when you observe local government is not every vote is unanimous, right? There's 5 people. In some cities it's 7 or 9 or 11 or whatever, but there are 5 people who vote, and there's some things that they just don't agree unanimously on. And so that plays out in these bigger regional bodies. The vote at ABAG was not 100% unanimous. Not everybody thought this methodology was great, but the majority, and that's the way that our government works, said this is the plan we're going to pursue. Palo Alto is a member of that community, a member of that regional planning community. And Palo Alto wants to exercise its power in that, but not unless it gets its way. And so now that it hasn't gotten its way, it's throwing a tantrum. Its leadership is throwing a tantrum saying, we don't like this number. It's not what we want. You all should pick up the slack, and we want to reduce our number even more. Because if we have to allow more housing, we don't think we'll be as prosperous and we'll have more traffic. But they're not acknowledging in that same breath that to push their responsibility onto others is to cause those same problems for other people. And part of this methodology was to calculate a fair share of new housing with regard to traffic impacts, with regard to revenue and taxation, with regard to the cost of doing business. And so when Palo Alto says, essentially, we don't want to do this, and we're gonna fight you on it, they're doing little more than just flipping the bird at all their neighbors, because everybody has this responsibility, and Palo Alto is not special.
Terrific. John, we're almost at time. Any final words of wisdom for folks on the call who are interested in getting involved, who want to learn more about housing elements, and otherwise stay engaged?
I'll put my email here in the chat, and feel free to email me questions. Feel free to ask to talk. I can easily set up a 15 or 30-minute call, and we can go over various parts of the housing element, various parts of the advocacy process. This is difficult. Unfortunately, it's not a statement of irony to say that these documents are not approachable to most people. You would think that something like a housing element that's so critical for the fabric of our communities and how we plan, both in the sense of housing and homelessness, in the sense of climate, in the sense of regional transportation and future thinking, that they would be easily distilled and approachable to the everyday person to be able to comment and engage. And they're anything but. We're paying, not we, but as the public, we're authorizing our elected officials to pay consultants $400,000, $600,000 a piece to build these documents. And in some cities, they're 300 pages, and in some cities, they're 1,700 pages. This is not easy stuff. So don't be discouraged about how big the document is, how you don't understand some of these terms, how you've never heard about this thing before, how I don't understand how zoning works, and if the lot's this big and it's this density, and what is this classification and the general plan? I don't even know what that is. It's not designed to have you engage. It's designed to check boxes. And since that changed in 2017, this is the first time the public is being centered in the conversation, and they're diligent public outreach to all economic sectors, all this stuff. We owe it to you as members of the public. We at Palo Alto Forward, we at YIMBY Law, we at YIMBY Action, we've said we take up this space. We know what we're doing. Ask those questions so that we can help get this machine moving.
Terrific. I think that's a great note to end on. John, a huge thanks for sharing your expertise and your perspective. Thanks to the audience for some really terrific questions. Again, this is going to be a monthly series. There's a ton to unpack in the housing element, as I'm sure you've realized over the last hour. And I hope you'll be able to join us next month on September 17th with Professor Chris Elmendorf of UC Davis Law School. Until then, we'd ask two things. First, please consider signing up for our newsletter on paloaltoforward.com. And then following up on one of the questions regarding the Palo Alto appeal of the housing targets, we'd also ask you to please consider signing our petition opposing what we consider to be a really misguided appeal of our affordable housing targets. We'll be sharing that important petition and other resources to all the attendees today. And I do hope you'll consider getting involved. As John said, this plan is really essential for our community, and to have everyone's input is really important. So thank you so much, and we'll plan on seeing you this time next month. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.